When it comes to games that define the early life of a given system, there are a lot of examples that we can draw from. Halo Combat Evolved for the Microsoft Xbox is a very good example of a game that defined the system's early days. Other such examples could be Super Mario 64 for the Nintendo 64, Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube, and for a more recent example, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild for the Nintendo Switch, all of whom were highly regarded games that released either at or near to the launch of that particular system. These of course are just cherry-picked examples, and each of these systems have their games that define the formative months of that system's life. And for as many games that made that system's life early on so compelling, there were some that were less excellent. When it comes to the PlayStation, it's difficult to pick a single iconic game. I'm sure many people who love the PlayStation will cite Crash Bandicoot, and it's a good example in all fairness, though my limited experience with the franchise leaves me wanting to look elsewhere. My first retro import review was of the arcade racing game Ridge Racer, which got a port to the PlayStation 1 across all territories as a launch title, and it also gave players a taste of what to expect with the system going forward. Now, about 8 months later, I'm coming back to review another launch title for the PlayStation 1, but this time a European launch title. And I'm of the opinion that this game is especially iconic because of the way in which it challenged the ways games could be presented and marketed. What game could I possibly be talking about? Well, I'm talking about WipEout. WipEout released in 1995 for the Sony PlayStation, first as a launch title in Europe on the 29th of September, then in North America on the 21st of November, and then in Japan on the 22nd of March the following year. The game would also see releases for DOS a few weeks later in Europe, and later on the Sega Saturn in 1996. It is a futuristic arcade racing game in which you pilot an anti-gravity racecraft in a field of 8 competitors across a few circuits across the world in the F3600 Anti-Gravity Racing League, complete with an especially distinct identity all to itself. The game was developed and published by Psygnosis, who are no strangers to creating games with unique identities, especially if you look at their prolific and substantial output for the Commodore Amiga from the 1980s to the early 1990s. Partnering with the Sheffield-based design studio The Designers Republic to create a lot of art and branding for the game, WipEout styles itself in line with the club scene of the 1990s. It's for the sort of people who bought albums by The Prodigy and Aphex Twin. Among its branding, rather infamously, was a poster found in many a magazine featuring a man of unknown identity and BBC Radio 2 DJ Sarah Cox, both kitted out in WipEout paraphernalia and with bloody noses. Combined with the tagline of "a dangerous game," it was undoubtedly given some amount of airtime for its reference to a drug overdose. WipEout sold especially well in Europe thanks to its controversial yet alluring image. It sold 1.5 million copies across Europe and North America, and it's certainly a game that found a market and pushed with it. And since I started to speak of image, why don't we start taking a look at the game good and proper, starting with the packaging. Here we have an example of packaging that is consistent across every region this game is released in. Not only is this rare for many series of games, but it's rare for the WipEout franchise in and of itself, as no other game in the series to release elsewhere in the world, as far as I'm aware, has the same artwork across all regions. There is a variant that exists in North America which features 3D rendered ships, as seen on the covers for some of the PS1, Saturn and DOS releases, but for the most part you'll be looking at the Designers Republic made cover. And oh me oh my, is it a thing of beauty. It is a genuinely iconic box art. The slight sheen on the grey background, the ship's wireframe, the logos scattered about the place, a tremendous amount of futuristic typography. It is a gorgeous cover. On the back I have an annoying gash on the back of the case. This may or may not be a symptom of that time I tried to pick up as many PS1 games as I could, not realising that the way I went about it was a really terrible idea both in practice and in theory. Anyway, we have a surprisingly dense collection of screenshots as well as a fair bit of text. The translation is to the side, of course. The screenshots are getting to me a little, however, because, well, they're fairly small. It's difficult to actually make out the contents of them, in fact. Anyhow, let's look inside. We have our game disc and is that a sticker set? Why yes, it is a set of WipEout stickers. Given the overall graphic design of the game's packaging, it makes sense to have stickers revolving around parts of it because it's just so nice. Anyway, let's look at the manual. Within its paper walls is some rather rudimentary information such as the background for WipEout's story, as well as some info on the controls which mention the game's compatibility with the Namco Negicon, among other things. You also get profiles for the various teams and pilots, which is pretty cool but also kind of weird. I suppose it's kind of neat to see this sort of thing for the purpose of world building, but in general you don't see anything of the story in any games going forward, so much as you see the effects of it, if that makes sense. Not to mention, this video is very much about the game's gameplay and the context of its release and why it became such a hit in Europe especially, more than it is about how anti-gravity racing came to be. In any event, let's get going and start playing. Except we have a little bit of a problem. For whatever reason, this game is a bastard to get running. I don't know if it's down to my PlayStation or if the game disc is damaged for some reason, or if the trickster god decided to play a cruel joke on me this time around. Whatever the issue is, it can take multiple tries for me to get this game running, and there's no consistent way to get it to run either. As it is though, it's what we've got, so we'll stick with it, and we'll get it to work. Onwards to the next part. The game opens up with a sequence showing us some logos, such as the iconic Psygnosis logo, as well as the logo for the Designers Republic. Following on from that, we get an FMV sequence of the crafts being prepared by little drones and lifters for a race, firing up, and all of a sudden the WipEout logo appears out of a wall along with all of the race crafts. Into the menu we go, and it's pretty simple. First port of call, the options, and we have a decent variety at hand here with the controller configuration, volume balance between sound effects and music, and data saving. After that, we start up a one-player championship, choose our speed class, choose our team, choose our pilot, and we wait a brief spell on the track to load before we are welcomed with the sights and sounds that greeted everyone playing this for the first time in 1995.
3, 2, 1, go!
The gameplay here is pretty straightforward. The goal, in championship mode at least, is to make it into the top 3 at the end of a given race in order to progress to the next one. To do this, understanding the flow of each track, as well as optimum strategies for navigating them, are crucial. There are a couple important things with these tracks that we need to keep in mind of course, and it mainly comes down to this game's party trick, the combat. Wait, I hear you inquiring, a racing game with combat? Why yes, this game has combat. As it happens, the combat in this game operates under much the same rules as Mario Kart does to an extent. There are 2 kinds of tiles placed strategically around the surface of each circuit, and if activated when driven over one, it will either provide you with a boost or with a weapon of some description. Some of these are offensive in nature, such as the rockets and missiles, whilst others are more defensive, such as the shield and the mines. But all of these will be useful in some way or another to hinder the pilot ahead of you or behind you. Do be aware however that just as you're able to attack them, they are able to attack you in kind. They can drop mines ahead of you, they can fire missiles, fire a shockwave. There is a bit of equity here. To make you aware of what's happening, a voice will boom out with the name of the weapon a nearby contender has before they're about to use it. That way you can take avoiding action if possible, or resign yourself to your fate. To explain the nuances of each weapon, I'll explain them fairly simply. We'll start out with the projectiles. Rockets are fired in a straight line and stop a contender in their tracks. Missiles are similar but are different in that they lock onto a target and follow them. Shockwaves also follow a target via lock-on, but they don't stop a competitor, but instead interfere with their controls a little bit. You will feel them all as you get hit, as you'll either stop dead in your tracks if it's a rocket or missile hit, or your controls will feel jittery and unnatural if you get hit by the shockwave. It's a surprisingly convincing effect. The next things are a little less offensive but no less useful. Mines, shield and boost. Mines are dropped behind the craft and anyone who ends up hitting one gets screwed, which can be really rather annoying at times, although that's usually the fault of the player. The shield and boost are primarily defensive, the shield basically protecting you from enemy attacks for a few seconds, with the boost giving you a sudden rush of velocity. Just be sure to use the latter of the two when you've got an open straight line ahead. As you play WipEout, you'll notice early on the different characteristics of the ships you pilot in the game, and they belong to 4 different teams in this universe, with each team focusing their craft on a particular trait, sometimes to the expense of others. The 4 teams in this game are Europe-based Physar, Russia's Kyrex, Japan's AG Systems, and America's Oricon Research. Each team carries 2 pilots, each with their own livery on their own craft to differentiate them. Playing as a given pilot will give you a portrait of said pilot on the results screen reacting to your success or failure, and although I do mock them, they are still pretty expressive and on the whole do a good job of showing the personality of the pilot. Which is weird to say because outside of this end screen, you see very little to do with the pilots. Unless you care about reading up on the lore of the series and who these pilots are, which, for some pilots, good luck finding anything, you're limited in what you'll find. Anyway, we're getting off topic, we should be discussing the ships in particular. With 4 ships in the game, the vehicle selection is somewhat similar to that of Ridge Racer, but there are only these 4 ships, not accounting for livery variation. Each team focuses on a different aspect of their ship, making some ships viable for different demands from the pilot, and they're all distilled into having 4 attributes on a scale, those being acceleration, top speed, weight and handling. Physar focus their craft to handling and acceleration, making it a dream around corners, but it doesn't take long for it to get to top speed. AG Systems have a similar philosophy, but favour acceleration and speed a little bit more, with a slight weight increase and slightly reduced handling. Oricon use a more speed-focused approach. Despite having the heaviest craft, it's reasonably well rounded as far as speed and handling go. Conversely, Kyrex has weak acceleration and handling, but has the highest top speed of any craft. In playing this, I found myself favouring the Physar and AG Systems teams. I like a nimble craft, and even though they're not as fast in a straight line, what they lose on the straights, they make up for in deftness around corners. Of course, what you like is down to you, and you may find yourself preferring the Kyrex or Oricon machines, but as with everything, you get out as much as you put in with them, and if you can control your craft well, that's all you really need. And speaking of control, let's go over the controls for this game. This game has an interesting way of affording control options for the player, in that you can select one of 8 control schemes. In a way, it's cool that they give you this many options, but at the same time, why not just let the player customise their controls off the bat, and save yourself the effort of coming up with control schemes for 99% of the players of the game? I used the preset B control scheme largely because the button placement makes the most sense to me, and accessing the buttons I need with my index fingers and right thumb is pretty much perfect for me. Not to mention this is the scheme that I'm familiar with, having started with WipEout HD many years ago. The control is surprisingly solid. You get a really good level of manoeuvrability despite being limited to a D-pad, as the game has no analog compatibility, something that wouldn't come to the series, or the PlayStation really, until much later, but for now it controls quite well. A part of why it controls as well as it does is its rather clever approach to going around corners at rapid speeds, and that is with the air brake system. Your craft will have a left and a right air brake, activated by the L2 and R2 buttons respectively. Air braking will enable you to swerve your craft around a turn at reasonably high speed, and getting it right is a rush every time, and feels almost like an achievement. The overall control in this game is very smooth and malleable, to say that it's controlled with the D-pad, and it's quite easy to acclimate to. The lack of analog control is unfortunate, but timing prevents that, and judging the game for that would be somewhat unfair. What I will say is that when it comes to piloting the crafts, things get really weird when it comes to piloting your craft near other racers and near walls. For example, I'm mildly convinced there's something of a magnetic attraction between you and your competitor's craft. Maybe I'm just terrible at racing close up and personal, but it feels oddly difficult trying to get past another craft when you're at a similar speed. The other problem I have when it comes to the control of the crafts is very similar to one of my issues with Ridge Racer, where, if you'll remember, I took an exception with how the game handled crash physics. I will say, WipEout isn't quite as egregious as Ridge Racer when it comes to the crash physics, but with WipEout, the main issue comes from how a contact with the wall results in your craft rolling like Peppy Hare commanded you to. Bumping into opponents isn't quite so bad, provided the speed difference isn't huge. If you're at a similar speed, you'll slow a little, but you'll be okay for the most part. If you accidentally crash into an opponent who you just hit with a rocket or missile, Newton's laws of motion be damned, you're stopping. Just imagine such extraordinary deceleration like that in real life. That would kill someone. One last thing I don't quite like about this game's control is not necessarily a control problem, but rather the starting procedure for each race. Much like Ridge Racer, Mario Kart and several other games of its era, having the right levels of revs can boost you off the line, whilst too many or too few will stall you. In concept it's fine because it's been done in many other games before, but it's difficult to learn where the ideal point is, given the speedometer's awkward design. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to aim for as far as throttle is concerned. I'm also really not a fan of how the camera resets for each race. I play arcade style racing games like this in chase cam, but by default you start the race in cockpit for each race. I would very much have liked it to keep the camera setting I selected. Anyway, moving on from the crafts and controls, racing games are defined not just by their selection of machines with which you can race. Sure, you can get the 50 billion different variants of Nissan Skylines in a given Gran Turismo game and drive them as much as you want, but if the track variety isn't up to scratch, then what's the point? So let's talk about the tracks WipEout has on offer here. There are 6 tracks in this game that you play through, each with a different environment, a different mood, and a different aesthetic to allow the player to recognise which track is which and get a feel for them. Each track also has its own recognisable characteristics to make them unique, but rather unusually for a racing game, the Championship mode arranges the track selection in terms of difficulty in a way, although I suppose you could argue Mario Kart does something similar. The first track is Ultima, based in Canada. It's a fairly long track with complexity kept to a minimum, and it serves as a gentle opener to what WipEout is. It has a lot of fast sections with twistier segments being kept relatively brief. Next is Carbonis, based in Japan. This fairly short track with a sweeping layout with Buddhist statues and torii gates draped with shide dotted around this mountainous track is home to an undulating S's section towards the end of the lap, requiring good control of your craft to navigate smoothly. Thirdly comes Germany's Terramax circuit. Slightly longer than Carbonis, it's designed chiefly as a fast flowing layout, complete with a jump over a river that I'll talk more about shortly, but you can expect a craft with high speed potential to be pretty good here. Korodera in Russia is our 4th circuit. This dystopically industrial looking track has a new feature, a fork in the road which converges shortly after that again, but affords the player a decision to make. It also has another big jump as well as a generally very twisty layout, but more on the jump later. America gets its look in with Aridos 4. Taking place within a canyon of some description, the track is really twisty, and much like Korodera, it has 2 forks in the road around the middle of the lap. Finally, a surprise mention of Greenland with Silverstream. Quite apart from being named alarmingly similarly to another certain motor racing track, Silverstream is a very difficult track. It's tight, undulating, and requires diligent use of the air brakes and clever use of the weapons. There is a solid variety within each of these tracks. There's some fast sweeping circuits, there's some tight and undulating circuits, then there are a couple that have attributes that go between the two. The different tracks ask the player to tackle different kinds of challenges, and for the most part I really like them, especially Aridos 4 and Carbonis. They're probably my favourite tracks in this game as they suit how I like to race. There are a couple sticking points for me however. The first of these comes in the form of the jumps that you have to do. On some tracks you'll be required to perform a substantial jump across a large pit, which I suppose is intended to make the crafts look incredible in some way. The issue is you need a decent, uninterrupted run-up in order to build the speed you require to fly over it, because if you're not going fast enough, you will fall into the pit and require being lackitude back onto the track by a drone that's probably looking at you like the dumbass you are probably feeling like right now for doing that. You don't even need to be too slow to miss it. You could just be at an awkward angle like on the jump at Corrodera, where until you jump for the very first time and realise that the angle is so incredibly important, you'll just fall and require being lifted back onto the track. You can't skip that kind of jump to find time, it's actively impossible, and it annoys me quite a bit. When you spent as long as I have exploiting the jump after the fork at Ubermall in WipEout HD, only to realise that you can't do it here, it feels somewhat demoralising, especially as my craft was angled in the direction the track was going. But even when Corrodera has a jump that I don't like, at least it's not an entire track that I don't like, as opposed to Silverstream. Unlike Silverstone, which I adore because of course I do, Silverstream is an exercise in futility from start to finish for me. When I mentioned it's tight, I meant that it was tight. It's so tight that corset makers are looking to it for inspiration. It's so tight new holes are having to be made in the belt. It's so tight it practices Kimbakubi bondage. The level of precision that you need to even finish in the top 3 is something that I struggle to muster even on Venom speed. It is a chaotic mess of trying to be fast while also trying not to crash, whilst also trying not to go slow around corners that the AI just decides it wants to vore you in. Still, despite one track not being to my liking and a couple having jumps that I'm not a fan of owing to how this game's physics work, the tracks are generally pretty good and they have a lot of good qualities to them that I can admire. With these tracks there's something for everyone, and there's a fair few details in each one that one can admire, which makes each track unique. The S's at the end of Carbonis are great for example, and it's one of my favourite sequences in the game. Although I complain about a track and some parts of other tracks, on the whole I would say that my general feelings towards them are that they are really good, are solidly memorable, and don't necessarily require obsessive levels of play to get the most out of them. Now, I've spoken at length about this game's ships and tracks, but I've made very little mention of how this game is presented as far as the audio-visual components go. So let's talk about the graphics and the audio. To begin, I want to talk about the work done by the Designers Republic for this game. I bought the A to Z of the Designers Republic last year for £85, and it's a book I really like to look through every now and again, because the work TDR have done over the years is just that mesmerising. For what it's worth, I'm not an art critic or all that much of a graphic designer. I don't know nearly enough about art to be able to determine how good their art actually is. But to cite the Pope from that one Monty Python sketch,
"Me don't know much about art, but I know what I like."
With that in mind, it's pretty cool to look at what went into the game and its visuals, and it's difficult to imagine what this game would have looked like had TDR not been involved in any meaningful way. The way the branding and logos are constructed feels very real, much like how sports like football and Formula 1 work these days. Each team and each racer has an identity all their own, and each one feels like a part of a larger system. For as constructed as this game is, the visual language this game uses feels very natural, and a reflection of what we see today. For the visuals we are looking at more than anything else, however, it's time that we talk about the graphics. For a game that released in 1995, the visuals are pretty impressive. When combined with the draw distance and nice details around the tracks, it looks pretty cool. Combine that with how the visuals and the branding from the Designers Republic meld together to create a game that's futuristic yet somehow grounded in its appearance, and you can see why I love this game's visual design. The only problem is that sometimes there's some polygonal flickering on a few things. I notice it mostly on the back of the Physar logo in the Team Select screen, but on the whole there isn't too much that's technically wrong with the game's graphics. As far as the audio is concerned, I'll talk about the sound effects first. The only problem, however, is that there aren't really all that many to talk about, as I've either mentioned them already, or they're the perfect example of the bleeding obvious. The basics are all here: jet sounds, collision sounds, sounds of confirmation when picking up weapons, someone screaming 3, 2, 1 go at the start, someone else shouting the names of the weapons anyone near you is about to use. I do like a few of the details with the sounds, however. Like, I've already mentioned how the distinction between what you have and what other pilots have as far as weapons are concerned are based on whether you hear a sound or a voice, which is cool and very useful. Also, as you go between buildings or walls that are close together or through tunnels, it produces a really nice echo effect, which hammers home the extent to which the developers wanted to make this feel believable, and I would say they did a very good job on that front. Lastly, on the audio front is the music. The soundtrack was chiefly handled by Tim Wright, going by the performing name Cold Storage. In this version, there are 3 extra tracks by performers such as Orbital, Left Field, and the Chemical Brothers. It's very rich with electronica and is of CD quality, which is no bad thing. The music is perfectly fitting for the mood and for the audience wanting a game of its era. Things were a lot more optimistic back in the 90s, weirdly. Curiously, my favourite track on the album isn't one of Tim's, it's actually WipEout Petrol by Orbital. It has enough heft to make it feel more energetic than the rest, I feel. That's not to say the soundtrack's poor, because there's some really good tracks on here, but as with most other things about this game, other entries make improvements. There is also a secondary album to complement the soundtrack titled WipEout The Music. It doesn't consist of any of Tim Wright's work. In fact, it's entirely consistent of remixed tracks based on works by performers such as New Order, The Prodigy, and Manic Street Preachers. It's quite difficult to acquire as it pretty much released only in the UK, although an Australian release does show up on Discogs, and is mainly a CD release that goes somewhere in the region of £10. As for any extra content, there's a surprising lack of extra content. That being said, it may sound like a counter to my main complaint with Ridge Racer, in that bonus content should have been implemented as part of the main game content. In fact, let me modify that prior statement. What I should be saying is there's a surprising lack of content, full stop. You have 4 different crafts to race in, you have 6 tracks, and you have 2 speed classes to pick from, Venom and Rapier. And we're going to talk about the Rapier speed class now, because this is where things get really leery. The difficulty in many arcade racing games like these come from the speed of the given craft. For example, Mario Kart generally has a 50cc, 100cc and 150cc option from the start, with a few bonus classes thrown in for completionist mad lads. If we look at WipEout as a series and consider the classes for what they are in the real world, Venom class would be something like going into a regional Formula 4 championship, or for an American approximation, the US F2000 championship or sprint car racing. By comparison, Rapier class is more akin to Formula 2, Super Formula, IndyCar, NASCAR Xfinity Series, or any other series that's of that sort of speed. The violent jump in speed and performance between these two machines is obscene. If you're not prepared for it, it will kick like a mule, and be really weird to pilot. Had there been an intermediary class, the curve might be a bit more gentle and easier to acclimate to. If I had more time and desire to try and beat the Rapier class championship, I would get access to a new track, however. It doesn't appear in the championships, and is only playable in single race and time trial modes, but it's something. Known as Firestar, it lists itself as being on Mars, which is most interesting. I would assume that this is non-canon, but whatever. It looks like an interesting circuit, but I question if it's really worth it for me to race on it, as I think it might be time for me to look to something new. And with that, I go to my conclusion. A pattern is starting to emerge with these games here, in that they don't really contain much of anything, and largely consist of just a few things. In fairness, this was a launch title for a very hot new system, but I cannot help but think that there was a missed opportunity here. In truth, WipEout was probably one of the better launch titles for the PlayStation, but I'm having difficulties with trying to be a bit less critical of it, for the simple reason that I know what the series is capable of much later down the line. However, what we did get at first was still a solid enough basis on which Psygnosis could build. The gameplay is a strong foundation, and with the general aesthetic, it gave it something to work with. Really, it just needed tightening, giving some extra circuits to run on, some more crafts, and a few other things, and it could have been great. As it is, we have a solid PlayStation 1 launch title that serves as a cultural touchstone, particularly here in the UK where Psygnosis market tend to reach the most. Now, I should talk about the game's language requirements and importability. For the language requirements, you do not need to worry about needing to understand any Japanese, as there is nary a lick of the language in the game outside of its stylistic use on the game's cover. Everything in the game itself is untranslated and pure. The manual might be a sticking point, but unless you want to know about the specifics of each craft, there isn't really much of a reason to worry about any sort of linguistic concerns. Playing the game is straightforward, no need for any Japanese. As for importability, well, this is where things get weird. Because at the time of writing, I saw only a few listings for WipEout across all sorts of different websites, primarily Yahoo auctions, and they were all in the region of 3,000 to 5,000 yen, which is a lot. I decided I'd dig a little deeper and try and check out sites like Amazon and more specialised sites like Mandarake, and no dice. The closest I could get was Super Potato, who have a copy of the game for 858 yen. However, they also have a no international orders policy, and they also don't deliver to proxies. As a result, unless you go to Japan, buy from Super Potato yourself, and come home with a copy of WipEout, you're going to struggle to find a copy pretty much anywhere online. It's very difficult to find a copy of the game, and it shows you just how different the market was for each region. Essentially, my advice would be to not really bother importing it via a proxy service, as the price for it isn't really worth it unless you buy other things with it as part of a bulk order. You might as well go to Japan and grab it yourself, or just stick to what's available in your region. That's not to say there isn't any benefit in getting it imported, however. If you're in America, getting either the PAL or NTSC-J versions will give you a slightly extended soundtrack to listen to, as I previously mentioned in fact. All in all, however, if you want to grab a copy of the game at some point, you may just want to stick with the region that you're in, simply to save you the trouble of searching high and low for a copy of a game that isn't really worthy of it, to be honest. Another option would be to look for another platform that the game is on, such as the Sega Saturn or DOS, mainly because both of those versions of the game still reviewed very well, even though the platform of choice tends to be the PlayStation. As I don't currently own a Saturn, nor do I feel like trying to make WipEout work on my PC, I can only rely on what other people say about the game so far, and from what I can ascertain, it's a solid enough choice to go for either version of that game, but the PlayStation seems to be the way to go anyway. As for where the franchise went, we have a fair bit of mileage to cover here. It barely took a year for a new instalment in the series to come out, it's called WipEout 2097, known in Japan and America as WipEout XL, and it would release on the PlayStation and eventually the Sega Saturn, PC, and even Macintosh, and most peculiarly, the Amiga. WipEout 2097 was similar to the original game but had a lot more meat on its bones, with new weapons, more interesting track selection, and the weapons actually do damage. You can destroy opponents with the weapons in that game that you accrue, and it's a more complete package overall as a result. A version for the Nintendo 64 called WipEout 64, quelle surprise, released as a sequel of sorts, taking place 1 year after, but on the whole, it serves as more of an expanded version of WipEout 2097, but it generally didn't trouble the likes of Nintendo's own F-Zero X, which was contemporaneous to WipEout 64. The series lay dormant for a while as Psygnosis would be taken steadily in under the wing of Sony Computer Entertainment, and during that time Psygnosis worked primarily on a whole lot of different things, until 1999 where Psygnosis Leeds, a separate arm of the studio, would develop WipEout 3. exclusively for the PlayStation. Standing in some strong stylistic contrast to 2097, WipEout 3 is a lot more reserved in its presentation of the future, and showcases a few major changes, with Tim Wright's involvement in the music no longer really being a thing, with performers such as Sasha, The Chemical Brothers, Paul Van Dyke, MKL, Underworld, Orbital and Propellerheads. Personally, I think it's one of my favourite entries as it introduces analog controls, something that would follow on from WipEout 64's inclusion of it. However, others were left wanting, and felt it wasn't as good as it probably could have been, and that it didn't really do enough to shake up the format of the series. WipEout 3 Special Edition would release exclusively in Europe in the year 2000, in a similar capacity to WipEout 64, to expand the game, and it added in a bunch of the older circuits from the series, as well as the 2 Japanese prototype tracks that were exclusive in the Japanese version of WipEout 3 originally, bumping up the track list to 22. And it also allowed for 4-player multiplayer, if you had 2 PlayStations and 2 TVs to play on. Come 2001, Psygnosis would be fully acquired by Sony Computer Entertainment, and had rebranded itself as SCE Studio Liverpool, where they would, from here on in, develop games for 2 racing franchises, one of them being WipEout, and the other being the official Formula 1 games, which they had done since 1996 up to 2007, when the license would be transitioned over to Codemasters for the 2009 season onwards. In 2002, they would release WipEout Fusion, the only game in the series to release exclusively on the PlayStation 2, and it would not release in Japan, weirdly. Taking criticisms on board from WipEout 3, SCE Studio Liverpool went on to make sweeping changes to the game's systems. Upgradable ships, an increased emphasis on combat, a return of character avatars, and a notably dystopic tone to the environment certainly caught people's attention, but you don't tend to hear much about the game these days, for some reason. Fusion also marked the point in the game series canon where the Anti-Gravity Racing League was in tatters, where corruption had its death grip on its integrity. Following on from this, however, in 2005, releasing on the launch for the PlayStation Portable, was WipEout Pure. Taking place in 2197, it takes place in a newly revived form of the Anti-Gravity Racing League called the FX300. It introduces a new slew of content, new tracks, a new shield system which enabled players to absorb weapons surplus to requirements so that you could replenish your shield, and several other new game modes. The game reviewed well, and was quickly followed by WipEout Pulse, which also released for the PSP. It also rather interestingly received a PlayStation 2 port, but only in Europe and in 2009, 9 months after another game in the series had already released. WipEout HD released on the PlayStation Network for the PlayStation 3 as a downloadable title in 2008, consisting largely of content derived from Pure and Pulse, but in wonderfully crisp 1080p at 60 frames per second, and it is currently one of the higher rated games in the franchise. It was followed up with an expansion pack called WipEout Fury, which released in 2009, consisting of a few new modes, an expanded campaign and a slightly modified interface, which I do quite like. It was also one of the games that was offered up in 2011 for free for PlayStation Network users who were affected by the 2011 outage, as part of the selection of 5 games in their Welcome Back campaign. This was one of the 2 games that I selected. I think the other one was Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty? For the release of the ill-fated PlayStation Vita, SCE Studio Liverpool would develop WipEout 2048, the game which was served as the very start of the series canonically, and the starting point for how anti-gravity racing worked, releasing on the Vita at launch in 2012. You can somewhat see the influence taken from traditional motorsport in that many of the circuits are within cities, much like how motorsport in its early years tended to take place in or around cities, with circuits like Les Sarthe and Spa-Francorchamps as examples of that in real life. The game reviewed reasonably well, although it did have a few technical issues that dragged scores down, such as long load times and a frame rate cap of 30 frames per second as opposed to the 60 frames per second that was traditional for the series at that point. In August of that year, it was announced that SCE Studio Liverpool would close down, bringing to an end a legacy of almost 30 years of game development, as far back as the days of the Amiga. The site, however, remains operational as SCE Studio Liverpool melded into XDev, a sort of development management team that Sony run, working on multiple projects with studios that exist outside of Sony's umbrella, like Supermassive Games and Sumo Digital. It was rumoured at the time of the studio's closure that it was working on a WipEout game for the PlayStation 4, something that would be radically different to what the series had done already, supposedly. The series, once again, lay dormant for a few years, until 2017, when WipEout HD, Fury, and 2048 all were compiled into WipEout Omega Collection for the PlayStation 4. It plays at 1080p at 60 frames per second on the standard PlayStation 4, with the Pro model capable of playing it in 4K at 60 frames per second, all with updated visuals and some incredibly smooth gameplay. It also got a PSVR update, which gave it a new dimension as far as its gameplay is concerned, placing you firmly in the cockpit of your craft. I don't own PSVR, so I don't know how it is, but I recall a friend of mine telling me that it's pretty great. It was the first game in the series to reach number 1 in the UK All Formats physical charts, and it reached number 15 in the digital charts, on top of reviewing very well. It definitely ranks up there as being one of my favourite ways of playing this series. It's one of my favourite racing games, and this is possibly the best way to play it all. WipEout is a little bit of a big deal in a way. I'm hoping Sony can bring the series back for at least one more title, because if there's one thing I would love to do, it's to experience a brand new WipEout game for the first time. I should note, I never grew up with these games. My first taste of this was in 2011, and whilst I really liked it, it wasn't until relatively recently that I truly began to appreciate the series, and the work surrounding it at that. It is genuinely incredible. Psygnosis may be gone now, but the work that they put into these games was simply excellent. This conclusion went on for a lot longer than I was intending, but I cannot express my liking of this series as succinctly as one might want. For a start, I'm bad at brevity, but for another, this series is an icon of an era. It's of a bygone time where games had both style and substance. It's something that I don't see quite as often as I would like anymore, at least not in the big budget space. Anyway, I should wrap all this up now because I've waffled on for long enough now. WipEout for the PlayStation is a good game, although the first is not really the one that I would recommend at this point. I'm much more likely to recommend that you play 2097 or WipEout 3 instead. In any event, if you are interested in getting this game, I would at least recommend getting it, but only if you can find it in a price that isn't ridiculous. Either that or go for a port of the game, like on the Saturn. In the next episode, we're going on a little bit of a holiday to a nice cosy town. It would be nice to go out and about for a change after all the horrors of the last few months. If you have any ideas of what I ought to cover in the future, please let me know in the comments or on Twitter, and my VG Collect list is down below in the description. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sidee.